So Shiv, we've talked about a lot about black swan events, like what they are, why, like how we could prepare for them and things like that. So now let's talk about what are the next black swan events. So what do you think would be like the next black swan events or like upcoming the next 5-10 years?
It's a really good question. There's a lot of factors here. There's a lot of different circumstances that are at play at the moment as well. You know, we've got, for example, at the moment we've got a lot of geopolitical tension in different various regions of the world. We've also got a very important election in the US. You know, US being a powerhouse. The policies that are set out by each government plays an important role in shaping the world economy and how the world reacts to it. So that's, you know, a big part. Then, you know, part of that election cycle, you've got internal political disputes, not just in America, but all over the world. This sort of battle between conservatism versus liberalism. Then you've got, that's from a geopolitical perspective. And then, you know, I think if we look at it separately, we've got our own internal black swan events that could happen at any point, right? So you've got our podcast, for example, like anything can happen at any point. Our health, we could be crossing the road, we could be driving. So that's more of a perspective of yourself. There's a lot of it could be a potential next black swan event. You know, we saw COVID and the impacts of that. Those are some of the things that I could really think of that I think are the next black swan events. We can get into it.
Yeah, I agree. Like I think obviously with geopolitics, there's like that tension that's going on, and if I was to really look at it from a second order perspective, it would be like, if these countries go into war and things like that, it could create, like, if nations collapse, those who depend on those nations for supply would also be affected. So even though they're not directly affected by the war, they're in a way indirectly affected in the long term because of supply and things like that they depend on for their resources. So now they have to get it from alternate routes or alternate places, which will create expense for even normal individuals that are living in those countries.
I think a lot of people underestimate the second, third order consequences of these events, impacts. You're right. Like COVID was a good example. You know, now the inflation that we're seeing and the high interest rate environments across the world, not just Australia, but across the world, is as a result of having to spend at a much higher rate than usual to combat, short-term effects. I think you spoke about it quite well in the last episode, but yeah, the geopolitical pressures, I think a lot of people just have a very narrow view, and I'm not saying everyone has that view, but I think what the consequences of those actions are, it doesn't get spoken up about enough. You know, everyone's just thought about the first step and that's it. But what happens after that? And, you know, you said it yourself, like supply chain issues and countries that you wouldn't think were impacted get impacted.
Yeah, exactly. And it affects shipments and, as we said, like supply chains and things like that. But there's also another part of it, which most people don't also think about, which is like cyber warfare. And I think this is going to become more of a threat than nuclear in the next 10 years as we advance. And the first, I guess, cyber attack in terms of war started during 1980. Well, I don't want to go too much in detail about it because it's sort of like a conspiracy with like the Soviet pipelines. So there's not a lot of hard evidence for it. So I don't want to really talk about it. But when I look at it in that perspective, I guess like the reason why it started during that time was because of during 1970s, like IBM and Apple produced like the first electronic computer. But there were also like computers that were produced in World War II during 1940s, but they obviously weren't to the point where it's like personal computers and it as advanced. But when you think about cyber warfare, people think like, oh, it's just a bunch of guys who are just going to scam for people and just tell people, oh, just give us some Bitcoin. But no, it's a lot more complex. It can do a lot more damage than that. And when we look at it from what it potentially can do, like, for example, imagine, right, one day, like, all infrastructure is shut down, like electricity grids, power grids. What type of consequences do you think that will cause? Like it'll cause basically transportation will be affected, financial services will be affected, like banking systems that rely obviously on the internet, and it'll just cause blackouts. Then we have to use candles and stuff to navigate around the dark. So that immediately affects millions of people, pretty much the entire country who's got their power grids down. And then you could just imagine like the second order, third order consequences. Obviously, financial impact will be the biggest thing. All those companies are just losing money. Every second, every minute of delay, money lost, basically. And stock exchanges crashing, major corporations creating, like probably even liquidating themselves with borrowed income money from other companies. It just creates a whole bunch of problems in just those few seconds and few minutes. And then obviously social unrest, like people can't trust each other. People are going to break into each other's places. It's like Purge, like that movie. I think it's called Purge, right? The Purge, where they...
Purge, yeah. Yeah, something along those lines, yeah.
Where they wear masks and they break into like people's and...
I think it's where there's no laws that exist for 24 hours.
Yeah.
Is that the movie? I think
I think that's what it is,
Yep.
And then I think with the social aspect, it would be like so much misinformation, but obviously it would be like through word of mouth, people creating conspiracies, people then, sabotaging each other instead of helping each other. And that's what it can lead to when you look at it from that perspective. And interestingly enough, in the past, in 2010, although like previous like cyber warfare type of attacks, there's something called Stuxnet. Did you ever hear about Stuxnet before?
No.
Right. It's surprising how no one really knows much about it, but it was basically like a sophisticated cyber weapon that was discovered in 2010. And what they did was they were targeting Iran's nuclear enrichment facility in industrial control systems. And it was designed to basically sabotage the systems by causing physical damages to the centrifuges. So basically what that means is just trying to break down and malfunction to basically cause them to delay and just increase their costs. And now, like, what would the consequences have been? It's just if they identified which nation was responsible for such a thing, right, then it's just going to create a catalyst for them to go into war. And then that could also create regional like countries or like obviously that are in relationships, right, be in conflict, like regional conflict as well. But anyways, the outcome of that was that it did disrupt their nuclear enrichment and cause physical damage and operational disruption. And it just delayed their nuclear ambitions. And the creator of Stuxnet was never really identified. And there's obviously conspiracies I'm not going to really go over, but it just showed you the power of cyber warfare. That could have potentially actually led to so many wars. In 2000, this is 14 years ago. So what we probably are seeing now could have happened a lot earlier. It could have escalated. So I'm just trying to show you like the power of cyber warfare. And now it's obviously more sophisticated and with AI and things like that. So if it can become a very serious type of thing. And I don't think people really realize how powerful it really is. The ability to shut down military like hardware and infrastructure with just a few smart individuals behind the scenes, makes the whole military useless.
That's a big, the cyber warfare, I agree. It's such an understatement in the sense that no one thinks of it as much. You're right. Like, I think COVID, for example, we saw, you don't know what it is until it happens, right? So COVID, like everyone spoke about sort of biological warfare, for example, right? And 100 years ago, we had, I believe it was a Spanish flu, and we had a lot of different viruses back then.
Like the Black Plague was
the Black Plague. That's what I was getting to. Sorry. And then that's had and then 100 years later, because technology did advance so much, we would have thought there would never be a sort of virus. Now we saw, COVID, and it's probably given ideas to countries or anyone that you could easily shut down the world economy just through a virus that impacts people's health. It was an idea, and it was an idea that was a reference point in the past, but it was never an idea that was a reference point in the present. And now it's become an idea that could become evident in the future. And that's the same thing with cyber warfare, is there are little things that are sort of building up to it. But until power grids are shut down by another country or any terror group or whatever it is, we won't actually understand it. And I think that goes back to the idea of hindsight bias as well. Because people, if it would have happened, people would, we knew the power grids would be shut down, etc. And I'm sure countries have ways to prevent that, 100%. But there's a lot of factors that come into that like hindsight bias comes in. Availability heuristics at that point as well. Like the first point for people to think of would be, we've been attacked by X, Y, and Z, instead of thinking, okay, like, could this have been, going a bit deeper, what could have led to this attack? But I think something that I picked up from when you were talking was, it's the second and third order consequences that have the most impacts. Have you thought, like, do you know what I mean? Instead of the first order.
So what would, like, in this case, the second order or third order be? Or
So
what are you
shutting
thinking
down
of?
power grids, like you touched on these examples really well, like the collapses of banking, technology being disrupted, military being underpowered, people not being able to communicate, people having to go back to the basics of surviving. That leads to, when you further add to that, mental health issues go up, desperation for survival, crime rates will increase significantly. People are just trying to survive at that point, right? So it's, the first sort of consequence of everyone's power's out, but it's what leads after that has a very compounding effect. The GFC, for example, selling subprime mortgages at face value. Okay, the American people can't afford their mortgages short term. People are thinking, all right, like whatever, we'll just bail them out. But that actually had a significant cascading effect because people didn't think how big this was. And then people were losing their pension funds, their superannuation, the money that they had, savings, all gone down the drain. And then, it allowed, those were the second and third order consequences because of what was happening initially, and the initial impact is quite low. Whereas the second, I think of it as a shockwave in a way. It's like, the inner circle is like one impact, but then the second, third circle, and the fourth circle expand a lot more and impacts a lot more people.
Yeah, wow, yeah.
So when you think of an earthquake, you know how it has a rip, like the circles get bigger.
Effect.
Yeah, it's exactly how it goes. It's that the initial impact is quite significant. The impacts after that, therefore, are just
that's what causes long-term damage, pretty much, and that could be like generational. It takes a generation to recover from that, or probably more, which people don't. Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very interesting analogy you used, the rippling effect. I really like that.
Another example, like CTE, for example, at the moment, right? We know concussions is a big problem in sports. We've also now identified that repeated head knocks repeated head knocks is not a good thing for a human being. But then the impacts of that, like CTE, that's been discovered a lot more. I was reading into it. There was a NRL player and an NRL coach, great former. Sadly, he's not with us anymore, Paul Green, and he was, was a really good player, and he coached the Cowboys to an NRL grand final win in 2015. And at face value, you think everything was great. He had a family, he had built a good success behind him and created a name for himself in NRL. I think it was last year, sadly, he took his own life and, passed away. And now that they've sort of discovered that he had very significant CTE, so his brain tissue was quite damaged compared to of a standard human being. And that's, Aaron Hernandez, I'm not sure if you've heard of that Netflix series. Yeah, he had significant CTE where he was very impulsive, and it draws out impulsive thoughts. Your mood is very dysregulated. It's not, you go through manic episodes of depression, then heightened versions of like optimism and good. So it has a very bad impact on your brain. But, it kind of shows that it's not the first, like those head knocks in that first 10 minutes, you might have a headache is not the problem. But it's what happens 50 years later or 40 years later to you that's the significant impact.
Especially like it being consistent as well, which obviously leads to a lot of long-term effects. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like sports like NFL and NRL, like I think boxers and martial artists, after a fight, they take a good 6 months off to let themselves recover. But NRL and NFL, these other sports where there's repeated head knocks, you're off for 2 weeks, you're back on. And then even back in the day, I would say, I've heard stories, you get knocked out, you're back in the game in 10 minutes. It's like get on with it sort of attitude. And look, I think now we've understood the impacts of it, and I think going back to it, it's a second and third order consequence that has a much more rippling effect.
Yeah, and it's like it's important to also think about like how to mitigate and like survive in those situations, basically.
Yeah.
Minimizing like the damages from the rippling effect, especially.
Do you see World War III breaking out?
I mean, look, obviously but it would have been called Black Swan if everyone predicted it, right? So obviously, who knows? It depends on how reckless and impulsive this person is to cause something like that. But most people, I think the most rational people wouldn't do that because, what is the objective? To be able to get land, to be able to get wealth, power, status, right? If they destroy majority of the world, how are they going to be able to how are they going to be able to, conquer, right? You can't even go on the land because it's all it's all radioactive. So from that perspective, I don't think World War III would really happen unless if there was like a sky world or an underground city, or unless we went to Mars. Then it probably makes sense, maybe. But I don't really see why and what it really occurring to that extent, where it's just like there'll be like obviously small like wars that are happening currently, but to World War III, I really don't think it would happen unless it's someone who's very impulsive and reckless.
I do agree. 100% agree with that view. I think a lot of people will say, yeah, we're on the brink of World War III. I think if we look at all of the history, kind of repeats itself, which is quite interesting. There's so many reference points in history we have that really show us, oh, these are red flags, and then choose to ignore them, and it happens. But if we looked at World War I and World War II, they all happened between a very short time frame. Between in 20 years, you've got two massive global scale war. 20 years? Yeah. To about 25 years. So from, think about like 1999 to 2024, you'd have two major global scale wars, which it's unspoken. Like it's very unheard of, right? But I think those wars also, there was a different catalyst for those wars at that time compared to what we're going through now. I also think because of what's happened in those wars and the impacts that we've seen, I think countries will try to be as conservative as possible in terms of preserving their people, and not just send them out endlessly into a war. But there's a quote by Albert Einstein that he made about whilst I bring that up, and it was something to do with nuclear. So I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. So I repeat that. He said, I think this was after the creation of the nuclear war, the nuclear bombs. And I think he was very he was not supportive of it because of, again, second thought order consequences, right? At that point, nuclear fission, great idea, create a big bomb, drop it on, I think it was intended to drop on Germany first. And then Hitler surrendered. Not Hitler, Germany surrendered. Hitler was dead. And then Japan refused to surrender. They just kept fighting. So initially, I think it was April 1945 where Europe was, I wouldn't say stabilized, but the Allied powers took over Germany and things got better. Sorry, I said no, I don't mean better, but the war ended in Europe, I would say. But the war continued in Japan, and so the reaction was to drop those bombs to really get them to surrender at that point. And so at that point, you think, yeah, it's just 2 nuclear bombs. What does that do? But now every country's armed. I wouldn't say every country, but every major country that has some sort of political influence in different regions of the world have access to nuclear warfare. And that's created because of the second and third order consequences of creating nuclear war. Now, the fourth and fifth order consequences, we don't know what it could be, but there's a risk of it breaking out. But yeah, Albert Einstein's quote, I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of ways of interpreting that one, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's saying that World War III will probably be the one that wipes out a good chunk of humanity.
If it goes to that extent where they use nuclear weapons. And I mean, the other part of it is also like the recovery. People don't think about like, the amount of money and like damage that's caused by wars. It takes generations of recovery. Probably still not even recovered to this day. Some nations, they haven't been able to recover from it. It's just like if it was to happen to the extent of nuclear, and with the relationships of countries, right, that have nuclear weapons, and if they go into war, just majority of the world would be wiped pretty much. And it's just the recovery for that would take thousands of years. Probably still there's radioactive damage. That's why I think it's just like when you look at it from a risk reward perspective, it's really not worth it. Like from that perspective, if you really think about it,
risk reward perspective.
Risk like as in from that.
No, you're right.
Perspective
you're
of
right.
like a leader, right?
100%.
Who wants to rule, like conquer well, like the land. It's just like from that perspective, it's not worth it. They wouldn't want to do that, but it's like obviously it can happen. But I think instead cyber warfare will be much more bigger play. It was like, you know what? We can silence and shut down the enemy without even making a move. I think it was like part of Sun Tzu's quotes. I can't really remember what his quote was. But The Art of War, yeah. Right. That's that book. And he talked about like being able to shut down the enemy before they can even make a move. Yeah, he's got very amazing quotes.
That's
memed a lot, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, again, COVID was an example of a virus that impacts people's health.
But imagine we had that without the internet.
Yeah. Would have been, that's true.
We would be devastated. Already depression and stuff was at all-time highs. But imagine without the internet. You were like locked down.
Why do you say that though? Do you think the internet allowed people to be more social at that time?
Not social, but it's like allowed them to be able to connect with their friends. Like at the end of the day, otherwise like you feel lonely, you feel depressed. And then at the same time, people were distracted with the internet as well. Being able to do some things, entertainment. Like a lot of online services went up as well. Subscription services went up crazy. Like Netflix and all those types of things. It kept people sort of... Also, communities were built. A lot of online communities from that time started to become popular because it wasn't really a big thing. All these online communities. So, yeah. And then obviously people can do work and all these types of things. So if that wasn't the case, people would have... What would people be doing? Locked down in their homes, not being able to do. Yeah, reading a book as well. But I think majority of people would not have the attention span to sit there and read a book.
Yeah, that's true.
And not being able to talk with people in person and things like that. Yeah, it's like solitary confinement.
That's when TikTok blew up as well.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So it's like it's basically like forced solitary confinement. Just imagine that.
There's a bit of a conspiracy there.
Yeah, but yeah,
I do agree. I think again that was a good example of showing the world that you can cripple an economy through a virus, and then add cyber warfare to that. You don't even need people. You don't even need soldiers on land with guns. You just need a few good scientists that know what they're doing and off you go.
Yeah, exactly. And that way you can basically be able to conquer the land without even any damage. You have the land basically without any costs of like recovery and things like that. Whereas nuclear, it's like you have a significant amount of generations of, time that you have to spend to be able to recover.
And I also think it's, if one country launches a nuclear, the other will launch it back.
Definitely.
and then one will launch another one. So everyone's destroyed. It's like in the attempt to destroy the enemy, you destroy yourself.
Pretty much, it's basically like multiplied by 0 at that
Yeah.
at that point, and it's a zero-sum game. Literally a zero-sum game.
So why does it still exist then? Maybe just to flex powers that we've got this, we've got that.
Maybe it's that, yeah, be able
I
to
think that's it.
threaten,
Just to
threaten, and just be able to blackmail, things like that.
send a message to the world that I agree.
It would have been better if it was used for asteroids or something that's more practical, you know.
Yeah.
Asteroids or something, but
even then, like those asteroid and asteroid impacts are just nuts when you think about it.
yeah, that's another black swan there.
Yeah, I mean that's what. Yeah. Oh yeah, that 100%. That's a more of a space version of a black swan event.
Or it could be even aliens. Yeah.
That's an interesting.